Hi, I'm Jeffrey, and right now we're going to look at the 66 books of the Protestant Bible. We're going to see what they're about and how they all fit together. Now, this is a big day for me because I don't think I've put this much information on a single whiteboard before in my life. So, we'll see how it goes. Now, the Bible is divided into two major sections. You have the Old Testament, which looks at the relationship between God and the nation of Israel. And then you have the New Testament, which looks at what Jesus did and what his followers did and taught after him. Let's start with the Old Testament books. There are 39 books in the Protestant Old Testament, and the Old Testament is much larger than the New Testament. Although 39 doesn't sound like that much more than the 27 books that are in the New Testament, the Old Testament makes up about 3/4 of the Bible in terms of just volume. That's because a lot of these books are really long. Let's take a look at some of these Old Testament books. Now, the Old Testament in the Christian Bible is split up into 4 different sections. You have the books of the law, and what happens here is you have God making promises to the nation of Israel and also making a special relationship with the nation of Israel. God says that while all the other nations worship all these other gods and they have all these pantheons, Israel must be exclusively loyal to God. And if they are, then God will watch out for them. He'll protect them. He will make them great. The books of history talk about how that relationship plays out, and it does not go so well for Israel. The books of poetry have a lot of worship and wisdom literature. A lot of good stuff for an ancient Jewish person to know. And then the books of prophecy are messages that God gave to his people at various points in history via human messengers. He would give a message to a human prophet, and then they would give that message to the people. So let's look at these books individually. In the books of the law, you have the book of Genesis, which starts everything off. You have God making some promises to a man named Abraham, saying, I am going to bless all the nations through your descendants. I'm going to give your descendants a special land, and I am going to give you a lot of descendants. There are going to be a lot of people that come from you. And that starts getting fulfilled in the book of Exodus. A lot of people come from Abraham. He has a lot of descendants, but they're enslaved in Egypt. So God sends a prophet named Moses, and he goes and he leads the people of Israel out of Egypt and takes them to this mountain where they make this pact with God. And that's where God says, I will be your God and you will be my people. And here's what that's going to look like. And if they remain loyal to God, if they keep that law, then things will be good. And if they don't, not so good. Leviticus deals with some of the particularities of what it means to be the people of God, because God is a very, very sacred and very powerful being. He is holy. And if people were going to be in close proximity and close contact with such a powerful being, then they also needed to be sacred. They needed to be reverent. They needed to be holy. And holiness is what the book of Leviticus is really about. The book of Numbers gets its name because at the beginning of the book, Moses counts all the people, and at the end of the book, Moses counts all the people again, because a lot of people died between those two countings on account of 40 years of wandering in the wilderness before entering the Promised Land. Right before they enter the Promised Land, though, Moses gives this big speech in the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy means second law because this speech is essentially Moses telling people, you're going to enter the Promised Land and you need to remain loyal to God. You need to remember the law. So Deuteronomy means second law because in many ways it's the second time that the law is given to the people of Israel. It's just a new generation. Now, once you have the law finished, the people enter the Promised Land. And so you have the book of Joshua. Joshua was Moses' right-hand man, and he leads the people into the Promised Land after Moses dies, and they occupy it. They all, set up their residences and territories in the Promised Land, and everything's good. until the book of Judges, when you have a few centuries of people really, really messing up. They don't keep the law, and you have people just descending into civil war and really nasty, terrible stuff happening in the book of Judges. In the book of Ruth, though, you have one person who is not an Israelite, a woman named Ruth, who is so loyal to her mother-in-law, who is an Israelite, that she converts to the Jewish faith. She moves back to Israel with her mother-in-law named Naomi and starts a new family there with her and a man named Boaz. Ruth becomes the ancestress of a man named David, whom we meet in the books of Samuel. David becomes this mighty king, and he is very, very loyal to God. David sets up a temple for all the people in honor of God. He is just this really, really great legendary figure in Jewish history. And we read his story in the books of Samuel and also the books of Chronicles. The books of Kings and Chronicles tell the story of David's descendants. How did that kingdom play out? And it didn't play out so well, because after David died, just kind of the same sort of story. Like you have Moses and Joshua dying, and then in Judges, everything starts crumbling. David dies, and then things start devolving in Israel as well. The people, over the course of a few centuries, abandon the law. They are no longer loyal to God, and so they are carried away into captivity. So you're seeing that we had a section before we meet David, just this pre-kingdom era, and then you have an era when you have a kingdom of Israel. You have King David and you have his descendants. But they go into captivity. But they don't stay there. In fact, they're able to come back a few decades later, and they can start rebuilding. In the book of Ezra, people rebuild the temple. And then in the book of Nehemiah, the people rebuild the walls of the city where the temple is. In the book of Esther, you have a brave woman who is not in Jerusalem, and she saves all the Jews from this genocidal plot. It's a really exciting book. On to the books of poetry. So in the books of poetry, you have very, very wise people exploring problems and different aspects of the world. In the book of Job, you have a good person who has some really bad stuff happening to him. So it's a long poem about why does God allow terrible things to happen to good people. In the book of Psalms, this is a book of worship, and so you have 150 different songs and poems that the Jews used to worship God. In the book of Proverbs, you have many, many wisdom sayings. These are things that Jewish people would teach to the young, to the younger generations, and say, this is how you make good decisions. Ecclesiastes, this is my favorite book of the Bible. Ecclesiastes looks at what is life really all about, and what's the smartest way or the wisest way of dealing with the hardships of life. Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, is a love poem, and it's kind of a steamy love poem. I'll leave it there. In the books of prophecy, you have God speaking to his people through these human prophets. And our books of prophecy in the Christian Bible are loosely divided into two groups. You have the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and then the minor prophets. And in the Jewish Bible, these are treated as just kind of one book, the 12, because there are 12 of them. So, Isaiah deals with God's judgment and then the comfort that awaits people, the people of Israel, after God's judgment will come. Jeremiah is speaking to the people and warning that they're about to go into captivity because they were not loyal to God. They didn't keep his law. Lamentations is a book of poems that mourn the fall of Jerusalem. It's very connected to that captivity that happens in the books of history. Ezekiel was a captive himself, and so that book deals with messages for the people of Israel during that time. And Daniel has not only a lot of good wisdom for ancient Jewish folks, but some insight into what God's perspective on world empires, past, present, and future, is. In the Minor Prophets, you have a lot of discussion of how is God going to deal with the people of Israel, how is God going to deal with the non-Hebrew nations, and how is he going to restore the world in peace and justice and order. And so these all discuss that in various nuanced ways. Let's go to the New Testament. In the New Testament, by the way, this is a tiny little gap, but there are about 400-ish years that transpire between the events of the Old Testament and the events of the New Testament. So in the New Testament, we have two major groups of books. We have the Gospels that deal with the story of Jesus, and then we have letters that are written by Jesus' followers exploring what do we do with Jesus' life and teachings. We have four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke cover generally the same material, and so they are called the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew presents Jesus as the King of the Jews. He is that rightful Messiah and the heir of good King David. Good King David designed the temple that his son Solomon built, and Jesus comes in, and in Matthew, he is the son of David. He is this righteous king of the Jews. In Mark, Jesus is presented as the servant of all. He is the suffering servant who comes in and he suffers on behalf of his people. It's the shortest of the Gospels. Luke wrote two books of the New Testament, the Gospel of Luke and then the book of Acts, which is a work of church history. Luke says, I'm trying to get all the facts about Jesus and lay them out in chronological order. And so that's what the book of Luke is about. It's very educational to teach one person in particular who Jesus was, what he did, and what he said. And then the Gospel of John is very, very focused on teaching that Jesus is God. It focuses on Jesus' divinity. That's what the Gospel of John is. It's all about getting you to believe in Jesus. The book of Acts, like I mentioned before, it's part 2 of Luke, and this tells the story of what happened after the Gospels. In all the Gospels, Jesus performs miracles, he dies, and he rises again. Acts says, well, what happened after he rose? And so it follows this group of close followers of Jesus, the apostles, and tells the story of how the good news of Jesus spread throughout the ancient world. And then we have the letters. These letters are grouped into, or they fall into a couple of major groups. The first 13 letters are called the Pauline epistles. They're the Pauline epistles. They are written by the Apostle Paul. And so the first large group of these letters are addressed to churches in certain areas, and they're named after the areas that they're addressed to. Paul talks about what the gospel is and how it works when he writes to the Romans. When he writes to the Corinthians, both times he's addressing concerns and questions that they have and that he has with them, because they had some problems. In the book of Galatians, Paul is writing about how the gospel works. Specifically, how does the good news of Jesus apply to people who weren't Jewish? They didn't have this history of a relationship with God. In Ephesians, Paul talks about how the church works and what does it look like to walk in a manner worthy of Jesus. In Philippians, Paul's writing from prison, and he's talking about how to rejoice and the joy that can be found in Christ. In Colossians, Paul is telling the people of Colossae how to live with the mind of Christ. What does it mean to set your mind on the things of Jesus? In his letters to the Thessalonians, he talks about Jesus' return and how to live in a manner that anticipates Jesus coming. Next, we have a group of books that Paul wrote to individuals. So you have the book of 1st and 2nd Timothy. Timothy was a church leader, and Paul is giving him instructions on how to run the church in an orderly fashion. Same deal in his letter to Titus. In the book of Philemon, Paul is talking about how should a Christian leader deal with a runaway slave that became a Christian. Really, really fascinating book there, and a very short book too. The book of Hebrews is interesting in that we don't know who wrote it, and there are a lot of very strongly held opinions about who wrote it. But the content itself is very important. It talks about how the person of Jesus and the relationship that we can have through Jesus is so much better than the relationship that was made available through the law, through the first 5 books of the Bible. It's a fascinating book about Jesus as the high priest for Christians. Next, we have the Catholic epistles, and Catholic doesn't mean they're for Roman Catholics. Catholic means they're universal, they're for everyone. The book of James talks about how the Christian faith works out practically. In the letters from Peter, Peter talks about the suffering that Christians are experiencing in the world, and also the glory that will come when Jesus returns. But he wants to remind people to be loyal to Jesus and remember his teachings and remember the truth. You have 3 letters that are attributed to John. That's 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And John is writing about the love that Christians should have for each other and the obedience that they should have to Jesus. The book of Jude talks about contending for the faith. He wants Christians to be aware of false teaching that's coming in. There are some people that are trying to twist Jesus' words. And Jude says, look out for these people. And then you have the book of Revelation, which is an apocalyptic book, but it is also kind of like a letter to a group of churches. And Revelation gives this grand vision of Jesus returning and setting up a new order in which everyone is ruled in peace and justice and fairness and light. It's a really great, happy ending to the whole Bible. So there you have it. Those are the 66 books of the Protestant Bible. It's going to hurt to erase all of this.